Hey everybody. So this is your last lecture for your Psych 101 lab, so that must be pretty exciting. I remember I was excited for my last one. And this lecture is going to be on Chapter 10, Social Psychology in the 40 Studies textbook. So the first study that your textbook talks about is the Stanford Prison Experiment. Conducted by Philip Zimbardo in the 1970s, this study is one of the most famous, but also one of the most controversial studies ever conducted. You'll find in reading and on a lot of in the video that you'll watch that this study is largely responsible for a lot of the rights of participants in research studies and a lot of the internal review boards and bodies that are responsible for approving research in this field of psychology. So Zimbardo thought that your environment was more important than who you are as a person. In other words, this is a nature versus nurture question, essentially, at least. And he really wanted to know whether or not your environment was more salient on your character or on your behaviors, or who you were as a person at your core was more salient at your behaviors. And it turns out, in this situation at least, the environment was much more heavily influential on people than were their core beliefs of who they were as people. So what Zimbardo did was created a fake prison at Stanford University, and he tried to make it pretty realistic. He put bars on the doors. There were guards in military uniforms. The inmates, sorry, I could not think of that word. The inmates were treated pretty horribly, and there was even a warden, and Zimbardo himself played the warden in the study. And in a video that I'm going to link below this, he talks about how that was really bad for the study because he lost sight of who he was as a researcher. He was more invested in the study and finding out what it would lead to rather than protecting the people in the study, which is very problematic for a number of reasons. So what the researchers found was shocking, and I've touched on this a little bit already. But essentially, in this study, when they simulated a prison environment, they found that the role that people were playing was much more salient than was their core characteristics, essentially. So people lost sight of who they were. Zimbardo himself, the primary researcher, lost sight of who he was, if that tells you anything. And the study was shut down early because Zimbardo eventually realized that what he was doing was not okay. I would be interested to hear everybody's thoughts on this because it is a really interesting study and it's very controversial, and I'm sure that you probably won't all have the same opinion on this study. So after you read about it and watch that video, I'd be interested in reading what you all think about that study. So the second study, Follow the Leader, was conducted in the 1950s by Solomon Asch, and he conducted an experiment on conformity. So the researchers aimed to determine if people would make their own decisions in a group setting, or if the decision of the group as a whole could influence the individual's decision. So researchers found that people will generally conform to group thought, and this can potentially lead to something called groupthink or herd mentality. Your book goes into more detail on this, and I'll post another video related to this study as well. But groupthink and herd mentality can be largely problematic. It sort of transfers blame from the individual to the group, which, when you're not thinking for yourself, that's not okay because you're still doing these things, right? The group doesn't protect you necessarily if you do something harmful. So anyway, but you'll learn more about that in your other psych classes. But this research sort of found that core tenet of herd mentality and groupthink. The findings of this study were significant to the field of psychology for multiple reasons. So first, the study showed that social pressures can have immense impact on individuals. Factors that include these pressures are social support. So if the group around you is supporting you, then you'll be more likely to do something, even if it's wrong. So in other words, you're not thinking for yourself. Attraction and commitment to the group. So the more you want to be part of the group, the more willing you'll be to do something that the group wants you to do. Really, no matter the ramifications, which, again, as you can imagine, is probably not a great thing. So the size of the group also matters. The bigger the group, the more intimidating it is to say no to the group. And then finally, the sex of the individual matters. So males and females actually differ a lot in whether or not they're subject to herd mentality and groupthink and things like that. I won't tell you who because your textbook covers it. But one gender, males or females, one binary gender in terms of this study, males or females, did actually follow the leader, so to speak, more than the other. And then I inserted actually technically the activity in that study on the right here, so you can make the determination for yourself whether you think that the line on the left matches either 1, 2, or 3 on the right. So the bystander effect. So inspired by a brutal attack in New York City in the 1960s, Darley and Latané conducted an experiment testing the bystander effect. What the researchers were really actually studying was something called diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is pretty simple. It means the more people that are around the more people that are around a potentially harmful situation, the less likely or the slower a singular person is to help. So in other words, the more people that are around when somebody's being attacked, the less likely somebody is to step in and help, or the slower somebody will respond to step in and help, which is pretty scary, especially if you're the person being attacked. So, not necessarily as extreme of an example, but if you imagine that you're walking down the street in Seattle and somebody just falls down, the more people there are around, the longer it will take for someone to actually check on that person and see if they're okay, or call paramedics or anything like that. Or no one will help at all because they think that someone else will do it. It's that sort of idea that, like, oh, I'm sure somebody else is going to help, which is depicted largely in the picture that I put on the left here, which is a pretty scary thing. So in their experiment, which is talked about in the 40 Studies textbook, the researchers' hypotheses were reported. So the more people there were, the less likely or less quickly somebody was to jump in and help a person. Their particular study measured people having seizures over the phone. They weren't real seizures or anything, but the more people that were on the phone call, the longer it took them to help the person that was having the seizure. So, which is actually, if anybody's taken a CPR class, that's why when you're administering CPR, you're supposed to look up, point at someone, and say, "You call 911." No one call 911 right now. But that's the purpose of that. And then I had a question for you all: is what would you do differently? I think that we all like to think that we would act very differently. We all would like to think, oh, I would absolutely be the person to jump in and help, especially after knowing this information. But subsequent studies have said that most people still will not jump in and help, or they won't help as quickly, which is it's pretty mind-blowing to me, honestly. And I've studied this a lot, and it's amazing to me. Okay, so the last experiment was shocking, no pun intended. So the famous Milgram study. The Milgram study is as famous or more famous than the Stanford prison experiment. So participants were commanded by the experimenter to shock people if they answered questions wrong. I have a picture on the left here that explains this experiment, and it's also talked about in your 40 Studies textbook. But essentially, the subject of the experiment thought that the person they were shocking was real, even though they weren't real. And then the experimenter just kept telling them to keep going. again, your textbook does a much better job of explaining it, and it's actually in the Stanford prison. It's part of the Stanford prison experiment video that I'll show. So if you want to have like more specifics or a more visual example, it'll be in there. Shockingly, no pun intended, most people reached maximum voltage before stopping, which is alarming because it was the idea that people would how do I say that? It was the idea that people would obey authority really no matter what. So even if they thought that they were hurting somebody, if the person in the white lab coat told them to keep going, they would keep going. And this was a surprising finding. So there's two main pieces of information to take from this study. So the first is that the role of authority is more pronounced than some people might have thought at the time. So even in this case, when researchers really were not supposed to have that much power, or they're not supposed to have that much power or control over a situation, they're clearly seen as authorities, as authority figures, and people of power, which is again why there are review boards to protect the rights of participants in research, and that's why they're so important. Is that so participants of research know their rights and know that they can walk away at any time without any penalty. And secondly, it seems as though even if participants were anxious and tense, they would keep going just because the person in the white lab coat told them they had to. Um, so the perception that people have of authority is really important as well, and this study showed that. So that's it for this lecture, and that's it for your lab. Congratulations, you guys all made it to the end. Yeah, great quarter, everybody.